Savannah doesn't shout. It hums. The city breathes in warm salt air, weaves Spanish moss through its quiet streets, and lets the past linger like smoke from an old fire. It's the kind of place where front porches creak under the weight of stories, some told, many buried. That was my first impression when I arrived in early October 2022. By then, the story had just begun to bubble up. A child was missing. His name was Quinton Simon, 20 months old. Blue eyes, tight curls, the kind of baby you'd see on a diaper package. According to the report filed on the morning of October 5th, he'd vanished from his playpen sometime in the night. I remember reading the dispatch in my hotel room, local news playing in the background. A toddler has gone missing from a home on Buckhalter Road. Police say the mother noticed the child was gone around 9 a.m. It wasn't the first time I'd heard of a missing child, but something about this one hit different. Maybe it was the age, barely walking, totally defenseless. Maybe it was the way the town reacted, like someone had pulled a thread that held the place together. That's what pulled me down from D.C. I wanted to see it up close. I wanted to understand what made this disappearance feel like a storm cloud on a sunny day. The house itself wasn't much, single-story, chain-link fence, scattered kids' toys in the overgrown yard. It sat at the end of a quiet stretch of Buckhalter Road, bordered by pine trees and silence. That day, a few sheriff's cruisers idled by the curb. Yellow tape cordoned off the driveway. Neighbors stood across the street, arms folded, whispering. Everyone seemed frozen between dread and disbelief. I talked to a woman named Joyce, who lived 2 doors down. We saw the mother pacing outside, she told me, voice low. Barefoot. Looked like she'd seen a ghost. Kept saying, he was just here. Then she shook her head. It don't make sense. No break-in. No sounds. Nothing. At that point, there were no signs of forced entry. No suspicious vehicles caught on the neighbors' cameras. No footprints in the dew. It was as if the boy had evaporated. That's what haunted people. Inside the house, deputies had begun a room-by-room search. I learned later that they pulled up vent grates, looked behind drywall, opened every drawer. Nothing. That night, a helicopter circled with thermal imaging. Dogs swept the nearby woods. Volunteers scoured the roadside ditches. I stood out near the marsh, flashlight in hand, surrounded by others who just needed to do something. The silence between us was louder than the hum of insects. By the next morning, flyers with Quinton's photo were posted on every gas station door, grocery store window, and telephone pole. A grainy baby photo, bright smile, round cheeks, one front tooth. Beneath it, missing child. Last seen wearing a light blue Sesame Street t-shirt and black pants. If you have information, call 911. The family hadn't spoken publicly, but locals said the boy lived with his mother, her boyfriend, her mother, the child's grandmother, and a few other people in the home. A full house. I took mental note of that. The kind of setup where people talk over each other, where things get missed. But I kept those thoughts to myself. At this stage, there was no reason to suspect anything. At least, officially. The police held a press conference that afternoon. A tight-lipped sheriff read from prepared remarks. We're treating this as a missing child case. All avenues are being explored. We urge the public to come forward with any tips, no matter how small. I watched the eyes of the officers. They were tired. But more than that, they looked uncertain. Like something wasn't adding up, but no one was ready to say it out loud. That night I sat in my rental car outside the house, windows cracked open, just listening. The cicadas buzzed. The house lights flicked off one by one. And still, no sign of the boy. Savannah was quiet. Too quiet. And I had a feeling the story was only getting started. By the third day, the streets around Buckhalter Road no longer felt like a neighborhood. They felt like a base camp. Marked units from the Chatham County Police Department lined both sides of the street. A mobile command center hummed under a temporary canopy. News vans had arrived, WCAV, WDOC, and eventually the Nationals. There was even a tent where volunteers gathered for search assignments. Someone had taped a paper sign to it, Quinton's Army. What struck me was the tone. No one was panicking anymore. It had settled into something worse, endurance. The belief that if you stayed long enough, searched deep enough, something would turn up. But every hour that passed without a lead scraped hope down to the bone. I spent most of that day walking with a local search party through the marshes west of the house. Knee-high water in some places, thorny brush in others. You learn quickly how sound could play tricks on you. One misplaced twig snap and the entire group froze, ears cocked towards some imagined whisper in the trees. Still, people kept coming. One man I met, Marcus, had taken 2 days off his job at the port. I didn't know the kid, he said, sweat dripping off his jaw. But I've got a niece that age. Feels wrong sitting at home. That was the mood. Not hysteria. Just a quiet sense of obligation. People brought out drones, offered horses, donated bottled water. But for all the movement, there were no breakthroughs. I kept circling back to the original 911 call. It had been placed by Quinton's mother, Leilani, 22 years old. I couldn't get my hands on the audio directly, but a law enforcement contact confirmed the basics. She told dispatchers the child was gone when she woke up around 9 a.m. The back door was open. She thought maybe he had wandered off. Odd detail. At that age, a child doesn't get far on his own. Not unnoticed. Not in that neighborhood, where every porch had a view of the street. I asked around. None of the neighbors had seen the boy that morning. No early walkers, no mail carriers. No one. I started watching the house. Not in a voyeuristic way, just observing. There was a constant flux of people, family members, friends, churchgoers dropping off food. Occasionally, I saw Leilani step outside to smoke. Her face was unreadable. Not stoic, not broken. Just blank. That wasn't an accusation. Grief's a strange thing. Some scream. Some go silent. But it stayed in the back of my head. By day 5, the FBI was involved. That escalated things. Agents in dark polos arrived with clipboards, laptops, and a purpose. Local command bowed back. This was no longer just a local missing child case. It had the Fed's attention. Behind the scenes, I started picking up whispers. Nothing official, just friction beneath the surface. Some volunteers felt they were being pushed out. Others resented the family for not joining the search in a more visible way. People began asking questions. Why didn't we hear from the mother? Why no emotional plea on the news? Why no press conference? Still, police kept their language careful. All parties are cooperating, they said. No one has been ruled out. But their focus was narrowing. That much was clear. They began issuing subpoenas for phone records, surveillance video, garbage routes. I managed to confirm that the sanitation company had been contacted. Not typical for a missing child case, unless there's a reason. That night, a rumor floated up through the back channels that law enforcement had begun tracking refuse collection from the neighborhood in the days before the disappearance. I drove to the waste management station outside town, a wide expanse of machines and landfill hills that stank even from the gate. The clerk at the front desk gave me a practiced shake of the head. Can't talk about that. But his face tightened when I mentioned the address on Buckhalter. At this point, no one was saying foul play out loud. But it was in the air. It hung behind every cautious statement, every tight-lipped reply from the sheriff's office. I walked back to my car and sat with the windows down, Savannah's late autumn heat sticking to my skin. Across the street, a flock of grackles exploded into the sky all at once. Somewhere in this quiet town, a 20-month-old boy was missing. And the storm was getting closer. I've covered enough cases to know when a police department stops looking out and starts looking in. By day 7 in Savannah, that shift was visible, even if no one dared speak it out loud. Gone were the hopeful updates, the appeals to the public, the maps marked with search grids. In their place, silence. Fewer interviews. Carefully worded statements. The public information officer wouldn't even confirm whether the home was still being treated as an active scene. That usually means one thing. Investigators have started forming a theory, and it doesn't involve a stranger. I kept a respectful distance from the Simon home, but others didn't. Protesters had begun to gather outside the property, holding signs and chanting through bullhorns. I watched from across the street as a woman shouted, "Where's the baby, Leilani?" over and over, her voice raw with exhaustion and fury. Most of them weren't locals. They'd driven in from neighboring counties, some from hours away, drawn by Facebook groups, TikTok live streams, and the raw magnetism of a child lost under unclear circumstances. It was clear the story had taken on a life of its own. That week, I spoke with a former federal agent who'd worked on child abduction cases. He walked me through the quiet cues that often go unseen by the public. When they start tracing garbage, he told me bluntly, they're not looking for a lost kid. They're looking for a body. That stuck with me. By October 12th, the Chatham County Police Department held a press conference, the most somber one yet. Chief Jeff Hadley stood behind a folding table, flanked by FBI agents and uniformed officers. His tone was flat, almost surgical. "We believe Quinton Simon is deceased," he said, "and we have named a prime suspect in his disappearance." He didn't elaborate, didn't say who. But the crowd outside the house already knew where their fingers were pointing. I held back. Emotion makes people reckless. And in this job, the worst mistake you can make is jumping ahead of the facts. But I also knew how these things work. If the police believed the child was dead, and they weren't arresting anyone just yet, it meant they were working on the how. Evidence, timeline, chain of custody. Enough to hold in court, not just the court of public opinion. Then came the landfill. I'd heard rumors from law enforcement sources that a specific dumpster had been flagged during the early stages of the investigation. Through GPS data and route logs from the sanitation company, they traced that container to a particular location at the Waste Management Superior Landfill in Chatham County. Let me paint that picture for you. A modern landfill isn't just a pile of trash. It's a machine. Trash is compacted by the ton, layered with dirt and chemical sealants, then buried under new layers by the hour. The idea of finding anything, after even a single day is near impossible. But the FBI committed to it. They brought in a full forensic recovery team, equipped with excavators, screeners, ground-penetrating radar, and specialists trained in identifying decomposed human remains. It was one of the most logistically difficult searches I've ever seen attempted. They had to section off a part of the landfill, thousands of square feet, and begin pulling it apart piece by piece. They built platforms, ran hoses, wore hazmat suits. Every load of refuse was sifted through screens by hand. The smell alone was described to me as chemical rot and battery acid. They called it a controlled nightmare. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched those teams work. Quiet, methodical. Each shovel of waste hauled away not just trash, but possibility. Hope turned to reality, reality turned to confirmation. In the meantime, Savannah waited. Still no arrest. Still no official name from police. But pressure was mounting. You could feel it in the air. People wanted answers. Protesters outside the house now numbered in the dozens. Some slept in tents across the street. Others played recordings of crying babies on portable speakers, day and night. The house remained mostly shuttered. Leilani hadn't been seen in public in days. And then, November 18th, everything cracked open. A statement from the FBI. Human remains had been found at the landfill. Partial. Degraded. But enough. The lab confirmed what everyone feared. Quinton Simon was no longer missing. The press release was cold. Sterile, even. The FBI has confirmed that human remains discovered at the Waste Management Superior Landfill are those of missing child Quinton Simon. But the silence that followed in Savannah? That wasn't sterile. That was grief, pure and unfiltered. It was November 18th when they confirmed it. 44 days after Quinton vanished. The landfill search, grueling, improbable, had paid off. And it felt like the earth itself had given up the truth, one foul, broken piece at a time. I managed to speak off the record with one of the forensic recovery team members, a woman who'd worked similar scenes at disaster sites. She wouldn't go into detail, professional ethics, but she told me the odds of success in a landfill recovery are typically around 5%. Everything has to go right, she said. The timing, the location, the preservation, the logistics. One slip, and it's gone forever. But it didn't slip this time. The FBI, working closely with the Chatham County Police Department, had identified a very specific dumpster, believed to have been used on the morning of October 5th, the same day Quinton was reported missing. GPS logs from the garbage truck, timestamps, and neighborhood surveillance led them to a single delivery site within the vast sprawl of the Superior landfill. From there, they reverse-engineered the location of the dumped load within a mountain of refuse nearly 30 feet deep. They began digging on October 18th. 32 days later, they found what they were looking for. I'll spare the details. But what they recovered was enough. Enough to stop the search. Enough to turn a missing persons case into a homicide investigation. Enough to end the story's first chapter and begin its darkest. Back in the neighborhood, things changed. The flyers were taken down. The protest signs turned angrier. We want justice, replaced, bring Quinton home. No more soft prayers. No more searching. The community wanted accountability. Yet still, no arrest. That puzzled people. It didn't sit right. But I understood the delay. Cases like these hinge not just on what is found, but how it's documented, preserved, and presented. Especially when the suspect is someone close. Someone trusted. Someone who knew the routines. In the background, investigators were working methodically. I confirmed that digital evidence had been collected, cell phone data, messaging apps, internet searches. They were building a timeline. What happened in the hours before the 911 call? Who was home? When was the last verified sighting of the child? And the landfill? It was no longer just a recovery site. It was now a crime scene. Anthropologists from the University of Georgia were brought in to assist. The remains were transferred to the state lab under armed escort. Every movement was logged. Every finding triple-checked. This wasn't just about confirming death. It was about building a case for intent, for cause, for culpability. At the same time, the community began to fracture. I saw it firsthand. People who once stood shoulder to shoulder in the search now argued outside the Simon home. Some believed the family had suffered enough. Others were convinced they'd been complicit. There were rumors of dysfunction, arguments, custody disputes, allegations of substance abuse. But rumors are cheap in cases like this. I tuned them out and kept chasing paper, court records, police logs, family service reports. What I found was troubling. A source tipped me to a sealed document involving a previous CPS investigation at the Simon home. I couldn't access the contents, but the timing, months before Quinton's disappearance, raised red flags. There had been concerns, but not enough, apparently, to remove the children. Not then. Meanwhile, the landfill workers, those unsung heroes, went back to their routines. Some wouldn't speak to press. Others said they'd never forget the search. It changed us, one told me. We'll never look at trash the same way again. I didn't blame him. For over a month, men and women in Tyvek suits had waded through filth and rot to bring a child's story to an end. Not because they were told to, because it was right. And yet, no one had been charged. That night, I walked alone near the marsh where we'd searched in the early days. The sky had turned gunmetal. Cypress trees hunched over black water. And I couldn't stop thinking about that child, 20 months old, barely more than a whisper, and how he ended up buried beneath America's garbage. I thought the story had reached its darkest moment. I was wrong. The arrest came quietly. No sirens. No press conference. Just a short notice from the Chatham County Police Department on November 21st. Leilani Simon has been taken into custody and charged with the murder of her son, Quinton Simon. For over a month, the town had danced around her name, implying, hinting, speculating, but never saying it outright. Some had assumed it. Many had rejected the thought entirely. No mother could do that. I heard it over and over. Until she did. Even as a reporter, even with years of hardened perspective, I felt something crack in me when I read the full list of charges: malice murder, concealing the death of another, false statements to law enforcement, making a false report of a crime. The weight of those words wasn't in their legality, it was in the betrayal they suggested. Not just of law, but of nature. That same day, I obtained part of the arrest affidavit through a legal contact. It detailed what had only been hinted at before. The timeline investigators had reconstructed, the discrepancies in Leilani's statements, the surveillance footage showing her disposing of a heavy object into a dumpster at a nearby mobile home park. Phone records, location pings, witness interviews, it all collapsed into one inescapable conclusion. The mother hadn't just failed to protect her child. She had erased him. But the truth was messier than that. It always is. Over the following days, I dug into Leilani's life. Court filings. Public records. Interviews with people who knew her, not the tabloid sources, but real, human threads. A friend from high school described her as sweet but lost. A former employer said she'd quit jobs abruptly, disappeared for days, sometimes showed up with bruises or glassy eyes. A neighbor recalled loud fights with her boyfriend, some of which ended with police at the door. No arrests. Just noise. I obtained a partial copy of a Division of Family and Children's Services report through a confidential channel. It wasn't complete, but it confirmed what had been whispered. This household had been under scrutiny. Prior drug use. Domestic disputes. Questions about stability and supervision. Quinton had been born into a house already teetering on the edge. According to the document, there were discussions about placing the children, Quinton and his siblings, with their grandmother, Billie Jo Howell. In fact, just weeks before Quinton's disappearance, a custody battle had been unfolding. Temporary guardianship, overlapping roles, unclear boundaries. Family court is rarely simple. But in this case, it had created a haze of responsibility where no one was fully in charge and no one fully accountable. I tried to speak with Billie Jo. She declined, politely but firmly. I didn't press. She was living through something no one should have to survive. In the official indictment, prosecutors argued that Leilani had acted with malice aforethought. That phrase stayed with me. Cold, legal, final. But how do you square that with what people saw? A young woman, often overwhelmed, sometimes unstable, now sitting behind bars facing a life sentence. Was she a monster? A victim of circumstance? Or both? That's what made this story impossible to look away from. There was no clean narrative, no evil stranger in a van, no break-in, no random chance. Just a child, in a house full of chaos, slipping further into the shadows, until he disappeared entirely. In court, Leilani pled not guilty. Her defense attorney argued that the case was circumstantial, that the evidence was incomplete, that trauma and postpartum instability played a role. But no one in Savannah seemed to be buying it. Outside the courthouse, the protests returned. Some held signs that said, "Justice for Quinton." Others just stared in silence, stunned that the unimaginable had become fact. And me? I kept thinking about the landfill, about the weeks of blind digging, the unlikely recovery, the commitment it took to give that child his name back. How the earth had spoken, but only after someone asked the right questions. For over a month, the city had prayed for a break in the case. And when it came, it broke everyone. The trial never happened. I was preparing for it. Press credentials, hotel bookings, courtroom seating maps. But Leilani Simon did what few expected. She took a plea deal. In March 2024, she stood before a judge in a Chatham County courtroom and pled guilty to murdering her son. No theatrics, no gasps, just silence. I sat 3 rows back. The room was full, but no one moved when the sentence was read. Life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Some said it wasn't enough. Others said it was a mercy. The judge, Tammy Stokes, was measured in her tone. She acknowledged the pain in the room, the failure of systems meant to protect children, and the devastation that had rippled out from a single act. This court is not in the business of vengeance, she said, but it is in the business of accountability. Outside, a few dozen people had gathered. No chance, just a kind of quiet relief. A child had died. His killer had been named. Justice, however imperfect, had arrived. But that was just the surface. Over the following weeks, I stayed in Savannah. I wasn't ready to leave. This wasn't a story you could step away from like closing a book. Too much still lingered. I visited the Superior landfill one last time. The search zone had been reclaimed, filled, leveled, seeded with grass. Nothing marked the spot where Quinton had been found. But the workers remembered. One waved to me from a loader, gave a tight nod. Another told me they still had moments where they'd pause mid-shift, waiting for a smell, a shape, a sign. Trauma lingers in muscle memory. At a small park nearby, someone had built a memorial. A few plastic toys. A faded photo of Quinton, taped to a tree. The words "Fly High, Little One" scrawled on the back of a paper plate. I stood there alone for a long time. One thing that stuck with me was how close this story came to being unsolved. Had police not tracked that dumpster in the early days, had GPS data not pointed to that specific drop zone, Quinton might never have been found. His mother's story might have stood. Another unsolved case. Another cold file in a drawer. But they did find him dead. And that changed everything. It also changed Savannah. The police department issued a statement in the months after the trial, acknowledging gaps in intervention and promising better coordination with family services. Whether that happens remains to be seen. Politicians spoke of reforms, new protocols, but policies don't hold children at night. People do. And that's where this story always returns, to the people who saw things, missed things, tried things, failed things. I think of Billie Joe Howell, the grandmother, the woman who fought for custody, lost, and then lost everything. I think of the workers at the landfill, the volunteers who scoured ditches and drained swamps, the cops who had to hold back tears in front of cameras. I think of the strangers who dropped off diapers and candles and teddy bears. And I think of Quinton, not as a case file, not as a symbol, just as a boy, a child whose life was short, chaotic, and interrupted, but who, in the end, was not forgotten. As I packed my notes, I realized this wasn't a story I'd ever be able to move on from entirely. Some cases stay with you. They haunt you in the quiet moments, the blank pages. This was one of them. Savannah went back to humming. The moss still sways in the wind. But beneath that calm exterior, something lingers, a silence you can't quite explain. A whisper beneath the porch floorboards. A name caught in the marsh air. Quinton Simon. He mattered. And that's why we tell the story.